As the US presidential election nears, Cuba is watching closely, aware that the outcome could shape its economic and social future. Democratic candidate Kamala Harris and Republican contender Donald Trump have both maintained a hard line on Cuba, but analysts note significant differences in their approaches.
Just came around to say hello. I'm so fly. You took a nosedive. Careful when you play on my level. For you it's so. Hey, hello.
Motorola Razr 50 Ultra. Flip the script.
Hello, Moto.
For decades, the US trade embargo on Cuba has constrained the island's economy. During his previous term, Trump added new restrictions and labeled Cuba a state sponsor of terrorism, undoing the diplomatic opening by former President Obama. Analysts in Havana suggest that while a Harris administration might ease sanctions to prevent regional instability, a second Trump term could mean increased pressure, further straining Cuba's economy. Trump has pledged to terminate Biden's parole program, which has allowed thousands of Cubans with US sponsors to enter the country legally. Cubans fear that Trump's plan to tighten immigration and sanctions would worsen conditions. Cuba's economic crisis peaked recently with a power grid failure, causing island-wide blackouts and sporadic protests. While Cuban officials blame US sanctions for complicating fuel and equipment purchases, critics highlight Cuba's economic mismanagement. This crisis has fueled a migration surge, with nearly 1 million Cubans leaving since 2020, affecting both nations as migrants arrive at the US border. In the US, Cuba has been largely absent from campaign discussions. During the 2020 election, Trump's stance on leftist regimes in Latin America won over Florida's Cuban-American voters. This cycle, with Florida seen as solidly in Trump's favor, neither candidate has prioritized Cuba in their messaging. A Republican spokesperson defended Trump's prior sanctions while labeling Harris as weak on adversaries.
Trump's prior sanctions on Cuba ended the disastrous Obama policy that ultimately flowed funds to the repressive Castro regime. Under weak Kamala Harris, our adversaries, including Cuba, are emboldened and everyone is less safe. President Trump will fix it starting November 5.
Meanwhile, the Harris campaign emphasized her support for Cuban rights and opposition to authoritarian regimes, contrasting her stance with Trump's prior engagement with such leaders. Both candidates indicate a hardline stance on Cuba, but the question remains whether either would pursue meaningful shifts in US-Cuba relations, which could impact Cubans' everyday lives.